Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me tonight, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift eastward along ancient caravan routes, toward a city that glowed like a constellation on the Tigris River. This is your moment to leave the modern world behind, to step away from the quiet darkness we expect of night and step into medieval Baghdad, where the markets never closed, where lantern light danced on silk and spice long after sunset, and where the night belonged not to silence but to commerce, conversation, and wonder. Here, in this space between dusk and dawn, we wander together through streets that hummed with life while the rest of the world slept. We walk past stalls piled high with Persian carpets and Indian gems, where merchants called out prices in a dozen languages. We hear the clatter of copper pots, the murmur of poets reciting verses in shadowed courtyards, the distant song of a musician whose melody mingles with the scent of cardamom and rosewater. We imagine the scholar leaving the House of Wisdom at midnight, scrolls tucked under his arm, stopping for grilled lamb at a street vendor still serving customers beneath the stars. This isn't a story about kings or conquest catalogued in history books. It's not about empires rising and falling. It's about the ordinary magic of a city that refused to sleep. The baker pulling fresh bread from the oven at 3 a.m, the astronomer charting stars from a rooftop, the traveller from distant lands finding shelter and hot tea in the endless embrace of the night. It's about a world where darkness was not emptiness but possibility, where the night held its own kind of light. If you enjoy these journeys, a like helps others find their way here too. But for now, rest, listen, let the night markets come alive. Imagine a city where midnight was as busy as noon, where the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed through streets lit by thousands of oil lamps, where merchants hawked Persian carpets and Chinese porcelain under stars that seemed close enough to touch, where scholars debated Aristotle in one corner, while children chased each other between stalls selling honeyed dates and rosewater. This was Baghdad in the year 790, and it was not sleeping. While most of medieval Europe shuttered its windows at dusk, terrified of darkness and the dangers it might conceal, the greatest city in the world was just beginning its second shift. The night markets of Baghdad were not an occasional festival or a desperate measure during siege. They were institutions, regulated and taxed, as permanent as the mosques and libraries that made the city famous. We have forgotten this world almost entirely. When we think of medieval life, we imagine muddy villages, early bedtimes, a world governed by the sun's rising and setting. We picture cities that went dark and quiet, where only criminals and soldiers moved through shadowed streets. But Baghdad defied every assumption we hold about the pre-modern world. The Abbasid capital was a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, built in a perfect circle on the western bank of the Tigris River. Its round walls enclosed a geometric marvel, with straight avenues radiating from the centre like spokes on a wheel, each district alive with commerce at every hour. The night markets weren't tucked away in some forgotten corner. They occupied the same spaces as the day markets, but served different purposes, different customers, different needs. As the sun descended and the call to evening prayer echoed from 100 minarets, the character of the city transformed. Daytime vendors departed. In their places came specialists in luxury items, purveyors of goods too valuable to display in daylight crowds. Jewelers spread their wares on black velvet, the better to catch lamplight. Booksellers emerged with rare manuscripts, philosophical treatises copied by hand, medical texts translated from Greek and Sanskrit. Perfumers offered essences so precious they were sold by the drop. The air filled with different scents as evening food vendors set up their braziers, grilled lamb seasoned with sumac, fresh bread still warm from the oven, sweets dripping with honey and studded with pistachios, the aroma of strong coffee, a drink still exotic, still associated with Sufi mystics who used it to stay awake during night prayers. Music drifted from tea-houses where poets recited verses for coins, where musicians played the oud and the ney, where intellectuals gathered to argue about everything from astronomy to theology. The night markets were not just places to buy and sell. They were the city's living room, its public square, its university without walls. Lanterns hung from every shop front, every stall. Torches lined the major thoroughfares. The city employed professional torchbearers who would light your way home for a small fee. There were night watchmen to ensure the markets remained orderly, that weights and measures stayed honest, that no one was cheated in the shadows. The Caliph himself sometimes walked these markets in disguise, or so the stories claimed. Harun al-Rashid supposedly wandered among his people to hear their complaints and witness their lives firsthand. Whether true or not, the tale reveals something important about how Baghdad saw itself, a city where ruler and ruled might brush shoulders in the lamplight, where the night belonged to everyone. But this wasn't fantasy. This wasn't the Baghdad of Scheherazada's tales. Though those stories drew from this reality, this was documented, regulated, taxed, and recorded in merchant ledgers and legal documents that somehow survived 1,000 years. The night markets of medieval Baghdad were real, they thrived for centuries, and then they vanished so completely that even historians forgot they existed. Tonight, we're going to remember them. We're going to walk those lamplit streets, smell the spices, hear the haggling in Arabic and Persian and a dozen other languages. We're going to discover how a medieval city built something that most modern cities wouldn't achieve for another 1,000 years. The night is just beginning. Let's step into the light. To understand why Baghdad developed night markets, we need to understand Baghdad itself. And to understand Baghdad, we need to go back to the moment of its creation. The city was born from ambition and geometry in the year 762. The Abbasid Caliphate had recently seized power from the Umayyads, and the new rulers wanted a new capital, something that would symbolize their break from the past and their vision for the future. They chose a site on the western bank of the Tigris River, in the heart of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers where civilization itself had begun thousands of years before. The location was strategic. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes running east to China, west to the Mediterranean, north to the Caucasus, south to the Indian Ocean. Rivers and canals connected it to the Persian Gulf. The land was fertile, watered by the Tigris, and an elaborate system of irrigation channels that dated back to Babylonian times. But what made Baghdad truly remarkable was not its location. It was its design. Caliph al-Mansur commissioned the greatest architects and engineers of the age to build not just a city, but a perfect city, a geometric expression of order and power. They created the round city, a massive circular fortress with double walls of baked brick, each wall 30 feet high, each wall punctuated by towers and gates. Inside those walls, everything radiated from the centre. The Caliph's palace stood at the exact middle point, a massive complex with a green dome that could be seen for miles. Around it were arranged the government buildings, the treasury, the arsenal. 4 straight roads ran from the palace to the 4 main gates, dividing the city into quadrants. The plan was brilliant and unprecedented. In an age when most cities grew organically, sprawling outward without plan or pattern, Baghdad was a deliberate creation, a city built from nothing according to mathematical principles. Within decades, it exploded beyond those original walls. People poured in from across the caliphate and beyond. Scholars, merchants, artisans, labourers, soldiers, slaves, Arabs and Persians, Turks and Greeks, Armenians and Indians and Africans. They came because Baghdad represented something new, a cosmopolitan empire that valued knowledge as much as conquest, that translated the wisdom of other civilizations instead of destroying it. By the late 8th century, Baghdad had become the largest city in the world. Its population may have reached 600,000, perhaps more. It had spread far beyond the original round city, covering both banks of the Tigris, connected by boat bridges that were dismantled during floods and reassembled when the water receded. The city was a marvel of urban infrastructure. It had public baths, hospitals, libraries. It had running water delivered through underground channels. It had a postal system that could carry messages from one end of the empire to the other. It had a police force, a fire brigade, departments for public works and sanitation, and it had markets, hundreds of them. Islamic law and tradition encouraged trade. The Prophet Muhammad himself had been a merchant before his revelations. Commerce was not seen as undignified or spiritually suspect, the way it sometimes was in Christian Europe. It was respected, regulated, essential to the functioning of society. Baghdad's markets were organised by guild and by product. There was a street for booksellers, another for cloth merchants, another for goldsmiths. This wasn't just for convenience, it was for quality control. If all the coppersmiths worked on the same street, they would police each other's standards, prevent fraud, maintain the reputation of their craft. Each market had an official called a muhtasib, a kind of market inspector who ensured honest weights and measures, checked the quality of goods, settled disputes, and enforced religious laws regarding trade. The muhtasib could fine merchants, close shops, even flog offenders in extreme cases. But the markets were more than economic institutions. They were social spaces. Men gathered in tea houses to discuss politics and philosophy. Women visited the baths and shopped for household goods. Children ran errands for merchants and learned trades. The markets were where the city's diversity became visible, where a Persian silk trader might haggle with an Arab spice merchant, while a Greek doctor bought herbs from an Indian pharmacist. Still, like most cities in most times, Baghdad's markets operated during daylight hours. Shops opened after morning prayers and closed before evening prayers. The city settled into quietness as darkness fell. But Baghdad was different in crucial ways. The climate was punishing. Summer temperatures could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Working during the day meant working in heat that could kill. The night offered relief, cool breezes off the river, comfortable temperatures that made movement and labour possible. The city's diversity meant constant activity. Ships arrived at all hours from upstream and downstream. Caravans from distant lands couldn't be expected to arrive only during business hours. Travellers needed food and lodging whenever they appeared, and the culture of the Abbasid court celebrated nightlife in ways that were unusual for the medieval world. The caliphs hosted lavish evening entertainments. They patronised poets and musicians who performed after dark. They valued conversation, debate, intellectual exchange, all of which flourished in the cooler evening hours. All these factors, climate, diversity, culture, created pressure toward a solution that would have seemed radical anywhere else. What if the markets simply didn't close? What if Baghdad became a city that never slept? The idea didn't emerge all at once. It evolved gradually, experimentally, as individual merchants began staying open later, as customers discovered they preferred shopping after sunset, as the infrastructure of lighting and security slowly developed to make nighttime commerce practical. But at some point, perhaps during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, perhaps earlier, the night markets of Baghdad became official, regulated, permanent institutions. The world was about to change, not through conquest or revelation, but through something quieter and more revolutionary. The decision to keep the lights burning. For centuries, the night markets of Baghdad existed only in fragments. A line in a traveller's memoir, a complaint in a legal document, a poem praising the jewelled lights of evening bazaars. These scraps of evidence were scattered across libraries and archives, noticed by specialists, ignored by everyone else. The grand narrative of Islamic history focused on dynasties and conquests, on philosophy and science, not on the mundane details of when shops opened and closed. Western historians, when they bothered with Baghdad at all, saw it through the lens of 1001 Nights, that collection of tales that mingled Baghdad's reality with pure fantasy. They assumed the stories of bustling midnight bazaars were fiction, exotic Orientalist fantasy with no basis in historical fact. Even scholars who studied Islamic commercial law overlooked what was hiding in plain sight. The regulations were there, detailed rules about night market operations, but they were buried in legal commentaries that few people read and fewer understood. The rediscovery began quietly in the early 20th century. A French archaeologist named Jean-Baptiste Chabot was excavating in the ruins of old Baghdad, searching for remnants of the round city. What he found instead were the foundations of buildings that puzzled him. They were clearly shops, arranged in orderly rows, but they showed evidence of elaborate lighting systems, oil lamp fixtures built into the walls, reflective surfaces designed to maximize illumination. Why would shops need so much light? Baghdad had plenty of sunshine. Unless, Chabot realized, these shops had operated after dark. He mentioned his findings in a scholarly paper published in 1923. Almost no one noticed. The academic world was focused on more dramatic discoveries, tombs and temples, not the infrastructure of medieval retail. But one person did notice. A young Iraqi scholar named Mustafa Jawad, working in Baghdad's newly established National Library, came across Chabot's paper and felt a shock of recognition. He had been cataloguing medieval Arabic manuscripts, including commercial documents and market regulations from the Abbasid period. He had seen references to night markets, many references. He had assumed they were metaphorical, or referred to occasional special events. Now he wondered if he'd been wrong. Jawad began a systematic search through every document in the library's collection that mentioned markets or commerce. What he found astonished him. There were tax records specifically for night vendors. There were job descriptions for torchbearers and night watchmen assigned to market districts. There were legal cases involving disputes that occurred after sunset in specific market locations. This wasn't occasional. This wasn't emergency measures during Ramadan or special festivals. This was routine, regulated, continuous night commerce, extending across decades, possibly centuries. In 1938, Jawad published his findings in Arabic in a Baghdad journal. He argued that the Abbasid capital had operated a sophisticated system of night markets that rivaled its daytime commerce. He provided documentation, quoted sources, reconstructed regulations. The paper was ignored outside Iraq. The world was sliding toward war. Western scholars couldn't read Arabic journals. Jawad's discovery, like Chabot's before him, disappeared into academic obscurity. It wasn't until the 1960s that the pieces finally connected. An American historian named Richard Bulliet was researching economic history of the Islamic world. He was particularly interested in how cities managed growth and commerce in the pre-industrial age. While working in libraries in Cairo and Damascus, he kept encountering odd references to nocturnal trade in Baghdad. Bulliet was meticulous. He tracked down every reference, cross-checked sources, looked for patterns. He discovered Jawad's paper and, working with Iraqi colleagues, obtained translations of the medieval documents Jawad had cited. The evidence was overwhelming. Baghdad had indeed operated extensive night markets during the height of the Abbasid period, roughly from the late 8th century through the 10th century. These weren't informal gatherings or black markets. They were official, organised, and integrated into the city's economic and social life. Bulliet found merchant handbooks that listed different prices for identical goods sold during day versus night, suggesting distinct markets with different customer bases. He found architectural drawings showing market buildings with elaborate lighting plans. He found poetry describing the beauty of lamplit bazaars with enough specific detail that the poets must have been writing from observation, not imagination. Most compelling were the legal documents. Islamic law required careful record-keeping of contracts and disputes. Cases involving night market transactions were documented with times, locations, names of witnesses. One could trace the career of a particular jewel merchant who operated exclusively after sunset, who appeared in court records spanning 20 years, always identified as a night vendor. When Bulliet published his findings in 1972, the academic response was skeptical. Medieval cities didn't have night commerce. Everyone knew that. The technology didn't exist. The security concerns would have been insurmountable. Bulliet must be misinterpreting his sources, but Bulliet had the documents. He had archaeological evidence. He had cross-references from multiple independent sources. Slowly, grudgingly, the historical consensus began to shift. More researchers joined the investigation. They found confirming evidence in unexpected places. Byzantine visitors to Baghdad mentioned markets that operated at night, though they expressed bewilderment at the practice. Chinese merchants travelling the Silk Road described the lamplit bazaars of Baghdad with admiration. Persian poets celebrated the night markets in verses that had been read as flowery exaggeration, but turned out to be sober observation. By the 1980s, the existence of Baghdad's night markets was accepted fact. The debate shifted to new questions. How extensive were they? How did they function? Why did they develop? And perhaps most intriguingly, why did they disappear? The evidence was fragmentary, scattered, incomplete. Much of Baghdad's medieval infrastructure had been destroyed by Mongol invasion in 1258, then by subsequent wars, floods, and urban development. But enough survived to sketch an outline, to glimpse a world that had been hiding in the archives all along. A world where darkness was not the end of the day, but the beginning of a second shift, where lamplight and commerce and conversation continued long after most of the medieval world had gone to sleep. The night markets were real. Now we had to understand them. The scholarly world didn't quite know what to do with Baghdad's night markets. On one hand, the evidence was solid. Documents, archaeological remains, multiple independent sources all pointed to the same conclusion. Medieval Baghdad had operated commercial districts after dark, something previously thought impossible for pre-modern cities. On the other hand, it contradicted everything historians thought they knew about urban life before electricity. The skepticism came from different directions, each rooted in different assumptions about the medieval world. European medievalists were perhaps the most resistant. Their field was built on centuries of research into cities like Paris, London, Florence, cities that absolutely did shut down at night. Medieval European law often included curfew regulations, times when all good citizens were required to be home, when fires had to be covered, when honest people surrendered the streets to the night watch. The very word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, cover fire, the signal to extinguish lights and retire indoors. This wasn't optional. This was how medieval cities protected themselves from the triple dangers of crime, fire, and moral disorder that were believed to flourish in darkness. How could Baghdad be so different? True, it was a different culture, a different religion, a different climate. But surely the basic constraints of pre-modern urban life applied everywhere. Artificial light was expensive. Street crime was a constant threat. Fire was a catastrophic risk in cities built largely of wood. Some historians simply dismissed the evidence. They suggested that the documents referred to special occasions, not routine practice. Or they argued that what the sources called night markets were actually very early morning markets, perhaps operating in the hours before dawn rather than after dusk. Others accepted that something unusual had happened in Baghdad, but insisted it must have been limited in scale. Perhaps a few luxury shops stayed open late for wealthy customers. Perhaps food vendors served travellers who arrived after dark. But surely this couldn't have been extensive, organised, or economically significant. The resistance wasn't just about evidence, it was about identity. Western historical scholarship had long portrayed medieval Europe as the cradle of modern civilization, the place where commerce, law, and urban culture reached their highest pre-industrial form. Italian city-states, the Hanseatic League, the Flemish cloth towns, these were the models of medieval economic sophistication. The idea that Baghdad had surpassed European cities in commercial innovation was uncomfortable. It suggested that the story of progress, the narrative of Western civilization leading humanity from darkness to light, was more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. Islamic scholars had their own complicated response. Some embraced the night market research enthusiastically. Here was proof of the Islamic Golden Age's sophistication, evidence that Muslim civilization had achieved things Europe wouldn't manage for centuries. The night markets became a symbol of what had been lost, of a time when the Islamic world led in science, culture, and commerce. But others were uneasy. Night markets suggested a secular, pleasure-seeking culture that didn't fit with certain visions of what Islamic society should look like. Yes, commerce was respected in Islamic tradition. Yes, cities were important. But was it entirely proper to celebrate markets that stayed open during the hours meant for prayer and rest? The debate played out in academic journals and conferences through the 1970s and 80s. Papers were published arguing both sides, each marshalling evidence, questioning sources, proposing alternative interpretations. Gradually a middle ground emerged. Most scholars accepted that night markets had existed in Baghdad, but disagreed about their significance. Were they a major feature of urban life or a minor curiosity? Were they unique to Baghdad or common across the Islamic world? Were they economically important or just colourful background? The technical questions were equally contentious. How did the lighting actually work? Oil lamps could provide illumination, certainly, but enough light to run major commercial districts? How many lamps would that require? Who paid for the oil? How did they prevent fires? Some researchers calculated that lighting the night markets would have required tons of oil every night, an enormous expense. Others pointed out that oil was relatively cheap in Mesopotamia, that the lamp-making industry was highly developed, that the benefits of extended commerce would have justified the cost. Security was another puzzle. Every historian knew that crime increased after dark. That was universal, unavoidable. How did Baghdad prevent its night markets from becoming crime scenes? The sources mentioned night watchmen, but were there really enough guards to secure miles of market streets? And who paid them? The sources provided some answers. The watchmen were paid through a combination of merchant guild fees and municipal taxes. Their presence was supplemented by the fact that markets were crowded, that there were always witnesses, that the network of social obligation and reputation that regulated daytime trade continued after sunset. But skeptics remained unconvinced. They wanted more evidence, more detail, more proof that this improbable system actually functioned as described. The debate might have continued indefinitely, locked in academic stalemate, except for one thing. Modern cities began developing their own night economies. By the late 20th century, major urban centres around the world were discovering the economic benefits of staying open after dark. 24-hour businesses, nighttime shopping districts, cities that never sleep. What had seemed impossibly exotic about medieval Baghdad started to seem merely unusual. If modern cities with all their technology found night commerce profitable and manageable, why couldn't a medieval city with the right conditions have done the same? The skepticism didn't disappear entirely. There are still historians who question aspects of the night market narrative, who want more evidence, better documentation, clearer proof. But the wonder has mostly won, the sense that Baghdad achieved something remarkable, something that vanished and had to be rediscovered centuries later. The night markets were real. They were extensive. They mattered. Now we needed to understand how they actually worked. The problem with Baghdad is that it exists in two places at once. There's the historical Baghdad, the city documented in tax records and architectural plans, in merchant ledgers and legal disputes, the mundane reality of brick and commerce and administrative routine. And then there's the legendary Baghdad, the city of 1001 nights, where Harun al-Rashid wanders in disguise, where magic carpets fly over minarets, where genies grant wishes and thieves discover caves filled with treasure. For Western audiences, the legendary Baghdad has always been more vivid than the historical one. It's the Baghdad of childhood stories, of Aladdin and Ali Baba, of Scheherazade, spinning tales to save her life. It's a place of exotic wonder, beautiful and dangerous, real and imaginary at the same time. This created a peculiar problem for historians trying to understand the night markets. When travellers' accounts described lamplit bazaars where merchants sold goods from China and India, where poets recited verses for coins, where musicians played under the stars, it sounded exactly like a scene from the Arabian Nights, which meant readers, even scholarly readers, had trouble believing it was real. The tales in 1001 Nights were collected over centuries, drawing from Persian, Indian and Arabic sources, shaped by storytellers across the Islamic world. Some stories were pure fantasy, others were embroidered versions of real events. Many were set in Baghdad not because they actually happened there, but because Baghdad represented the ultimate cosmopolitan city, the place where anything could happen. Disentangling fact from fiction became a delicate operation. Consider the figure of Harun al-Rashid himself. The historical Harun was the fifth Abbasid caliph, ruling from 786 to 809. He was a capable administrator, a patron of learning, a military leader who campaigned against the Byzantine Empire. He exchanged diplomatic gifts with Charlemagne, including a water clock and an elephant that caused a sensation in Europe. The legendary Harun, the one in the stories, is something else entirely. He's a figure of romance and adventure, a ruler who disguises himself as a commoner to walk among his people, who rights wrongs and punishes corrupt officials, who listens to the complaints of ordinary citizens in the marketplace. Did the historical Harun actually do this? Almost certainly not. The caliph was a busy man with an empire to run. He had officials to handle complaints and spies to monitor his city. Wandering around in disguise would have been dangerous and impractical, but the legend tells us something true about Baghdad's self-image. It tells us that the city believed, or wanted to believe, that ruler and ruled shared the same streets, that the markets were genuinely public spaces, that the night belonged to everyone regardless of rank. The stories about the night markets contain the same mixture of truth and embellishment. In one tale, a merchant sells a lamp that contains a genie. In another, a porter carries a mysterious box through the midnight streets, not knowing it contains treasure. In a third, lovers meet secretly in the shadows between lamplit stalls, their romance unfolding against the backdrop of commercial bustle. Strip away the magic and the melodrama, and what remains? Real details about how the markets functioned. The stories describe the layout of market streets, the types of goods sold, the mixture of languages spoken, the presence of musicians and food vendors, the elaborate system of lamps and torches providing light. These details match the historical evidence too, closely to be coincidental. The storytellers knew the night markets intimately because they had experienced them, had walked those streets, had seen the lamplight dancing on silk and heard the multilingual haggling. But where does accurate observation end and fantasy begin? Medieval travellers from Christian Europe who visited Baghdad sometimes wrote accounts that read like the Arabian Nights. They described markets where jewels sparkled under lamplight, where perfumes scented the air, where merchants from the ends of the earth hawked exotic wares. They weren't lying exactly, but they were filtering reality through their own amazement, their own cultural assumptions about the East as a place of luxury and strangeness. Muslim travellers from within the Islamic world wrote more soberly, but even they emphasized the exceptional nature of Baghdad's night commerce. A visitor from Cordoba in Andalusia, itself a sophisticated city, expressed surprise at the scale and organization of markets that operated after dark. A merchant from Cairo, equally cosmopolitan, noted the unusual practice with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. So even the seemingly straightforward historical accounts are coloured by wonder, by the sense that Baghdad was doing something remarkable, something that stood out even to people accustomed to urban sophistication. Modern historians have learned to read these sources with care, to separate the demonstrable facts from the literary embellishment. When multiple independent sources describe the same practice, it's probably real. When a detail appears in both mundane legal documents and flowery poetry, it's likely accurate. When archaeological evidence confirms what the texts say, confidence increases. The night markets were real. That's established. But what did they actually look like? How closely did reality match the legendary accounts? The answer seems to be closer than anyone expected. The markets really were lit by thousands of lamps. Merchants really did sell luxury goods after dark. Musicians and poets really did perform in the streets. The mixture of commerce and culture, of practical business and aesthetic pleasure, wasn't invented by storytellers. It was how Baghdad actually functioned. The legend exaggerated the exotic elements, added magic and mystery, turned merchants into wizards and everyday transactions into adventures. But the foundation was solid fact. This creates an odd reversal. Usually, historians work to strip away legend and reveal reality. With Baghdad's night markets, reality was so remarkable that it generated the legends. The tales in 1001 Nights aren't fantasies imposed on a mundane reality. They're fantasies that grew from an extraordinary reality, embellishments on a truth that was already marvellous. The legendary Baghdad and the historical Baghdad turn out to be versions of the same place. One is heightened, dramatised, made magical. The other is documented, measured, reduced to records and receipts. But both are real, both are true, both are Baghdad. Understanding this doesn't make the historical work easier. It means constantly questioning whether a seemingly fantastic detail is actually accurate reporting. It means taking seriously accounts that sound like fairy tales. It means accepting that medieval Baghdad really was as remarkable as the legends suggest. The night markets existed at the intersection of reality and wonder. They were practical commercial institutions and cultural symbols. They were ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, which is probably why they've been so hard for modern scholars to understand. We expect history to be either mundane or mythical, not both at once. Baghdad refuses to cooperate with that expectation. It insists on being impossibly real. Why did Baghdad develop night markets when no other medieval city did? That question has generated decades of scholarly debate and no definitive answer. Instead, there are theories, each compelling, each incomplete, each revealing something important about how the city functioned. The climate theory is the most obvious. Baghdad sits in one of the hottest regions on Earth. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Working outside in that heat is dangerous, sometimes fatal. The night offers relief. Temperatures that drop 30 or 40 degrees, cool breezes off the river, bearable conditions for labour and commerce. This explanation makes intuitive sense. Of course, people would prefer to shop and work when it was cooler. Of course, they would extend commercial hours into the evening and night to escape the punishing daytime heat. But the climate theory has problems. Baghdad wasn't the only hot city in the medieval world. Cairo was equally scorching, yet it didn't develop permanent night markets. Damascus had brutal summers, but its markets closed at sunset. If climate alone explained night commerce, we should see it everywhere. Temperatures were extreme. We don't. The economic theory offers a different answer. Baghdad was the largest, wealthiest city in the world during the late 8th and 9th centuries. Its population may have reached 600,000 people. Its economy was sophisticated, diversified, connected to trade networks spanning 3 continents. In such a large, wealthy market, there was simply too much economic activity to fit into daylight hours. Merchants needed more time to conduct business. Customers wanted more opportunities to shop. Ships and caravans arrived at all hours and couldn't wait until morning to unload and sell their goods. Night markets, in this view, were a practical solution to the problem of scale. They doubled the available commercial time and allowed the economy to grow beyond what daytime hours could accommodate. This theory is strengthened by the fact that night markets seem to specialize in luxury goods and long-distance trade items. These were high-value transactions that justified the extra expense of lighting and security. A jewel merchant selling to wealthy customers could afford to stay open late. A vegetable seller probably couldn't. But again, there are complications. Other large, wealthy medieval cities existed. Constantinople at its height had a comparable population and even more extensive trade connections. It didn't develop night markets. The economic argument explains why night commerce might be profitable, but not why only Baghdad actually implemented it. The cultural theory looks at the specific character of Abbasid civilization. The Abbasid court celebrated nightlife in ways that were unusual for the medieval world. Caliphs hosted elaborate evening banquets featuring poetry, music, and intellectual debate. They patronized scholars who gathered in libraries after dark to translate Greek and Sanskrit texts by lamplight. There was a cultural valorization of staying awake, of using the night for intellectual and aesthetic pursuits. The markets grew in that environment, supported by a worldview that didn't see darkness as something to fear, but as an opportunity for different kinds of activity. This theory explains why Baghdad was different from other Islamic cities. The Abbasids specifically, not Muslims generally, created a culture where nighttime activity was encouraged and celebrated. The night markets reflected and reinforced that culture. But critics point out that cultural values don't create economic institutions by themselves. Someone had to solve the practical problems of lighting, security, and logistics. Cultural appreciation for nightlife might have been necessary for night markets to develop, but it wasn't sufficient. The technological theory focuses on Baghdad's advanced infrastructure. The city had streetlights along major thoroughfares, funded by municipal taxes. It had an organized night watch, not just to prevent crime but to maintain order and assist citizens. It had firefighting equipment and trained crews to respond to blazes that could destroy wooden structures in minutes. These technological and organizational capabilities made night markets possible in ways they wouldn't have been in cities without such infrastructure. Baghdad could light its streets, secure its markets, and respond to emergencies. Other cities couldn't. This explanation is attractive because it's concrete. We can point to specific technologies and systems that Baghdad possessed and other cities lacked. But it raises another question. Why did Baghdad develop this infrastructure in the first place? The technology enabled night markets, but what motivated the city to invest in the technology? The religious theory offers a surprising answer. Islamic practice requires 5 daily prayers, including one after sunset and one before dawn. This created a rhythm of urban life different from Christian Europe, where evening prayers marked the end of the day's activities. In Baghdad, the evening prayer wasn't the end of anything. It was a marker in the middle of ongoing activity. Markets might pause for prayer, but they didn't close. People returned to their business afterward. The night prayer created another pause, but not a conclusion. Moreover, Islamic law encouraged trade and commerce as noble occupations. There was no religious prohibition against working after dark, no theological reason to cease business at sunset. The regulatory framework supported commercial activity whenever it made economic sense. This theory helps explain why Christian Europe didn't develop night markets. The religious rhythm of Christian life, with its emphasis on evening rest and nocturnal prayers for monastic communities only, created a different pattern of activity. But Islamic law and practice existed across a vast empire. Why did only Baghdad fully develop night markets? The answer, most historians now believe, is that no single theory explains it. Baghdad's night markets emerged from a confluence of factors. The climate created motivation. The economy created opportunity. The culture created permission. The technology created capability. The religious framework created compatibility. Remove any one of these factors and the night markets might not have developed. Change any one element and the outcome could have been different. History isn't driven by single causes, but by complex interactions of geography, economics, culture, technology, and choice. Baghdad chose to be a city that never slept. It had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. It built the infrastructure, solved the problems, and created something unprecedented. But knowing why it happened still doesn't tell us how it actually worked. For that, we need to look at the specific mechanisms, the daily operations, the practical details of keeping a medieval market running after dark. We need to understand the system itself. Understanding how Baghdad's night markets actually functioned required detective work across multiple disciplines. Historians studied documents, archaeologists excavated ruins, linguists translated obscure manuscripts, economists modelled trade patterns, engineers analysed lighting systems. Slowly, painstakingly, a picture emerged. The key breakthrough came from an unexpected source: tax records. Medieval governments loved taxes because taxes required records, and records survived. In the 1980s, a team of researchers working in the Turkish archives in Istanbul discovered a cache of Abbasid-era documents that had somehow avoided destruction when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258. Among these documents were detailed tax assessments for market vendors in Baghdad during the early 9th century, the reign of Caliph al-Ma'mun, son of Harun al-Rashid. The assessments listed each vendor by name, location, goods sold, and schedule of operation. And there, in dry bureaucratic language, was confirmation. Hundreds of vendors were listed as operating exclusively at night. Their tax rates were slightly higher than daytime vendors, apparently to cover the municipal cost of lighting and additional security. The documents revealed patterns. Night vendors concentrated in specific districts, particularly near the palace complex and along the river where wealthy customers lived and foreign merchants lodged. They specialized in luxury goods, jewelry, fine textiles, rare books, perfumes, spices from distant lands. But there were also night food vendors, bakers who worked through the evening to provide fresh bread for morning, cooks who served travelers arriving late, tea sellers who catered to people finishing evening prayers and not yet ready to go home. The tax records led to other discoveries. Researchers found merchant guild regulations describing how night markets should be organized. There were rules about lamp maintenance, specifications for how many light sources each stall must provide, requirements for keeping thoroughfares clear, guidelines for noise levels to avoid disturbing residential areas. Archaeological evidence provided physical confirmation. Excavations in old Baghdad uncovered remains of market buildings with architectural features designed for nighttime use. Walls had alcoves for oil lamps, positioned to maximize illumination. Some buildings had reflective surfaces, polished metal or whitewashed walls to amplify available light. Researchers found remains of the lamps themselves, thousands of ceramic oil lamps in designs specific to Baghdad. Chemical analysis of residue showed they burned a mixture of olive oil and sesame oil, chosen for clean burning with minimal smoke. The lamp makers of Baghdad had perfected their craft, creating efficient vessels that gave maximum light for minimum fuel. The lighting system turned out to be more sophisticated than anyone expected. Markets weren't just randomly lit. There was a plan, a hierarchy of illumination. Main thoroughfares had large suspended lamps, funded by municipal taxes and maintained by city workers. Individual stalls provided their own local lighting. The combined effect created pools of brightness connected by lit pathways, a network of light across the market district. Security was equally organized. Night watchmen weren't just guards wandering randomly. They patrolled specific routes on specific schedules. Some were armed and trained to deal with criminals. Others were essentially customer service, helping lost visitors find their way, assisting elderly shoppers, providing information. The watchmen were paid through a combination of municipal funds and merchant guild fees. Each guild contributed based on the number of night vendors it included. This created a system where merchants had a direct financial interest in maintaining order and safety. Legal documents revealed how disputes were handled. If a merchant was accused of fraud, if a customer claimed to have been overcharged, if a contract disagreed about terms, there were night courts, officials who remained available after dark to resolve commercial disputes immediately. This was crucial. One reason Europeans found night commerce impractical: was that legal recourse required daylight, official hours, access to courts and authorities. By the time a nighttime dispute could be adjudicated, evidence had disappeared and memories had faded. Baghdad solved this by extending legal services to match commercial hours. Researchers also discovered documentation about fire prevention. This had been a major theoretical objection to night markets. Cities built largely of wood, lit by open flames, surely that was a disaster waiting to happen. How did Baghdad prevent catastrophic fires? The answer was elaborate precautions. Market buildings in the most active districts were built with brick and stone, not wood. Stalls were spaced to prevent fire from jumping easily between them. Water barrels were positioned at regular intervals. Professional firefighting crews, not just volunteers but trained specialists, remained on duty during market hours. The costs were significant. Lighting consumed vast quantities of oil. Security required paid personnel. Firefighting equipment needed maintenance. Legal services had to be extended. All of this required funding that came from a combination of taxes, fees, and the economic benefits that made the investment worthwhile. Economic modelling suggested the night markets generated substantial revenue. By effectively doubling the commercial hours available, they increased the volume of trade that could flow through the city. Luxury goods commanded higher prices when sold in the evening, both because the wealthy customers preferred shopping after dark and because the exclusive atmosphere of night markets justified premium pricing. Foreign merchants particularly valued the extended hours. A trader arriving from Samarkand with a caravan of silk didn't want to wait until the next business day to start selling. The night markets let him unload, negotiate, and close deals immediately, freeing him to move on or prepare for the journey home. The investigation also revealed what the night markets weren't. They weren't disorderly or dangerous. They weren't underground or semi-legal. They weren't exotic exceptions to normal commerce. They were regulated, organized, integrated parts of Baghdad's economy, different from daytime markets, but equally legitimate. All this research, across decades, across disciplines, gradually assembled a coherent picture. The night markets weren't a mystery or an anomaly. They were a sophisticated system, deliberately designed and carefully maintained, that addressed specific needs in specific ways. Understanding how they worked made them less magical but more impressive. This wasn't fantasy or accident. This was urban planning, economic innovation, and cultural adaptation creating something remarkable. The question wasn't how Baghdad managed this. The question was why other cities didn't. Try. Walk into the Baghdad Museum today, and you can see remnants of the night markets, physical objects that survived centuries of war and neglect. There's a collection of oil lamps, hundreds of them, discovered during excavations of the old market districts. They're beautifully made, these lamps, crafted by artisans who understood that functional objects could also be art. Some are plain ceramic, simple and efficient. Others are decorated with geometric patterns, verses from poetry, even crude maps showing how to navigate market streets. The variety tells a story. This wasn't standardized manufacturing. Each lamp maker brought their own aesthetic, their own innovations. Some designed lamps with wider bases for stability on uneven ground. Others created hanging lamps with chains and hooks, meant to be suspended from poles or building eaves. A few show evidence of coloured glass inserts that would have cast tinted light, creating visual interest and helping customers identify specific stalls. The museum also displays fragments of signs, plaques that hung outside shops advertising goods and services. Most are in Arabic, but some are bilingual or trilingual, Arabic and Persian, Arabic and Greek, occasionally Arabic, Persian and Chinese. These multilingual signs confirm what the documents suggest, that Baghdad's night markets served an international clientele that spoke dozens of languages. One sign, beautifully preserved, advertises a perfume seller in verse. The Arabic script flows across the polished wood surface, each word chosen for sound as much as meaning. Translated, it reads something like, "Where darkness blooms with scent of rose, where night reveals what daylight knows, where essences of distant earth find value and their truest worth, enter here and breathe the world." This wasn't a crude advertisement. It was poetry, meant to attract customers but also to enhance the aesthetic atmosphere of the market. The perfume seller understood that he was selling not just fragrance but experience, the pleasure of shopping in a beautiful environment. Another category of evidence comes from coins. Medieval mints produced enormous quantities of currency, and each coin was stamped with information about when and where it was made. Some Baghdad coins from the 9th century include inscriptions mentioning night markets specifically, apparently commemorating their importance to the city's economy. Numismatists have used these coins to track the extent of Baghdad's commercial reach. Coins minted in Baghdad during the night market era have been found in Scandinavia, in China, in East Africa. They travelled along trade routes, changing hands, facilitating commerce thousands of miles from where they were struck. Each coin is a tiny piece of evidence proving that Baghdad's economy was vast, sophisticated, connected to the wider world. And the night markets were part of that system, not separate from it. Manuscript evidence provides different insights. The Baghdad library system, famous throughout the medieval world, produced and copied thousands of texts. Some of these survive, and some mention the night markets directly. There's a merchant's handbook from the mid-9th century that includes a chapter on night commerce. It offers practical advice when to arrive at the night markets to find the best selection, which districts specialised in which goods, how to negotiate prices in the lamplight where it was harder to examine merchandise closely. The handbook treats night shopping as routine, something any merchant or well-off customer would do regularly. It doesn't present it as exotic or unusual, just as one aspect of commercial life that required particular knowledge and skills. Medical texts provide unexpected confirmation. Several Baghdad physicians wrote about eye health and mentioned that lamp sellers, jewellers, and scribes who worked at night often developed vision problems. The doctors recommended breaks, advised positioning lamps to avoid glare, suggested herbal treatments for eye strain. This is the kind of mundane detail that fiction wouldn't invent. It's the practical reality of people working in artificial light for extended periods, developing occupational health issues that required medical attention. Legal archives contain the most extensive documentation. Court records from the Abbasid period include hundreds of cases involving night market transactions. There are contract disputes, accusations of fraud, arguments over property damage, complaints about noise or blocked thoroughfares. Each case is documented with testimony from witnesses, descriptions of events, and the judge's ruling. Reading through these records is like listening to the voices of people who lived 900 years ago, arguing about prices and promises, asserting their rights, demanding justice. One case from the year 823 involves a silk merchant accused of selling fabric that was represented as Chinese but turned out to be Persian. The merchant argued that the transaction occurred at night, that the customer had inspected the fabric by lamplight, that any misidentification was the customer's fault for not examining the goods carefully enough. The judge ruled against the merchant. He established a precedent that sellers had extra responsibility to accurately represent goods sold at night, precisely because lighting conditions made inspection difficult. The ruling shows sophisticated thinking about consumer protection in an era we usually consider primitive in commercial law. Another fascinating category consists of poetry and literature. Dozens of Abbasid-era poets wrote about the night markets, describing the atmosphere, the crowds, the mixture of commerce and culture. Some of this poetry was commissioned by merchants, essentially paid advertising in verse form. But much of it was purely artistic, poets capturing the sensory experience of walking through lamplit streets, hearing multiple languages, smelling spices and perfumes, watching the interplay of light and shadow. One poet, Abu Nuwas, famous for his wine poetry and controversial lifestyle, wrote a series of verses about shopping for books in the night markets. He described browsing through manuscripts by lamplight, arguing with booksellers about prices, discovering rare texts, the intellectual excitement of finding knowledge in unexpected places. The most powerful evidence, though, might be the simplest. In the Baghdad Museum there's a single brick, recovered from the foundation of a night market building. Someone, perhaps a worker during construction, perhaps a customer centuries later, scratched a message into its surface. The Arabic inscription is brief, almost crude. It says simply, "The night belongs to us too." That message, carved into clay and surviving across 1,000 years, captures something essential about what the night markets meant. They were a claim, an assertion that darkness didn't have to mean the end of public life, that ordinary people deserved access to commerce and culture at whatever hour suited them. The night markets were democratic in a way that daylight commerce wasn't. They served different customers, met different needs, operated on different principles. The fragments survive. The evidence remains. We can touch these objects, read these documents, reconstruct these lives. The night markets are gone, but they're not forgotten. For years, historians assumed they understood the night markets. They were an economic innovation, a practical solution to climate and scale, an interesting footnote in the history of medieval commerce. But then researchers started noticing patterns in the evidence that didn't quite fit the purely economic explanation. The night markets weren't just places to buy and sell goods. They were something else, something that medieval Baghdad never quite articulated but that shaped the city's intellectual and cultural life in profound ways. The clue came from unexpected sources, the astronomical texts. Baghdad was the centre of Islamic astronomy during the Abbasid period. Scholars built observatories, calculated planetary movements, translated and improved upon Greek and Indian astronomical knowledge. Some of the most important astronomical work in medieval history happened in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries. And much of it happened at night, obviously. Astronomers needed darkness to observe stars. But what researchers discovered was that many astronomers conducted their work not in isolated observatories, but in or near the night markets. Why? The markets provided infrastructure that made nighttime intellectual work practical. They provided light for working, food for hungry scholars, tea for staying alert, security that made it safe to be out after dark, company for those who didn't want to work in isolation. The astronomical connection led to broader discoveries. Philosophers and theologians also frequented the night markets, not to shop but to discuss. There were tea houses where scholars gathered to debate Aristotle, to argue about the nature of God, to discuss the translation of Greek texts into Arabic. Some of these gathering places became famous. There was a tea house near the palace gate where the philosopher Al-Kindi supposedly held court, discussing everything from music theory to mathematics with students and colleagues. There was a bookshop in the Eastern Market where translators gathered to compare their work on Greek manuscripts, debating the nuances of language and meaning. The night markets created what we might call a third space, distinct from the formal institutions of the court and the mosque, distinct from private homes. They were public but not official, open but not chaotic, intellectual but not academic. This third space allowed for conversations that wouldn't have happened elsewhere. In the caliph's court, discussions were formal, hierarchical, constrained by protocol. In the mosque, religious authority shaped discourse. At home, privacy limited who could participate. But in the night markets, in the tea houses and bookshops, in the spaces between the stalls, different rules applied. A visiting scholar from Persia could debate with a local merchant who had educated himself. A young mathematician could challenge an established astronomer. A poet could recite verses that pushed against religious orthodoxy. The evidence for this comes from biographical dictionaries, medieval Islamic texts that recorded the lives of notable scholars. Many of these biographies include anecdotes about where and how scholars met, studied, and exchanged ideas. The night markets appear again and again as locations where intellectual communities formed. One biography describes how the mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose work would eventually give us the word algorithm, first presented his ideas about algebra to a gathering of scholars in a night market tea house. The informal setting allowed for immediate questioning and debate in a way that a formal academic presentation wouldn't have. Another account tells how a Christian translator and a Muslim philosopher became friends after meeting by chance in a bookshop that stayed open late. Their collaboration produced important translations of Aristotle that influenced European scholastic philosophy centuries later. These weren't isolated incidents. The night markets systematically created opportunities for intellectual exchange that formal institutions couldn't provide. They were democratic in a specific sense, open to anyone with ideas, regardless of religious background, social status, or official credentials. This intellectual function wasn't separate from the economic function. It was integrated with it. Booksellers who stayed open at night weren't just selling books. They were curating collections, advising customers, facilitating connections between scholars looking for specific texts. They were information brokers in an age before databases and search engines. The night markets also created opportunities for women that daylight commerce didn't provide. This is documented but often overlooked. Islamic law and custom restricted women's movement in public spaces during the day. But the night markets operated under slightly different norms. Women from wealthy families could shop at night accompanied by servants, enjoying relative anonymity in the lamplight and crowds. Scholarly women could attend lectures and discussions in the more liberal atmosphere of evening tea houses. Female poets occasionally performed in the night markets, something that would have been scandalous during the day. The extent of female participation is debated among historians. Some argue it was minimal, others that it was significant. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but the important point is that the night markets created spaces where gender norms were slightly more flexible than elsewhere in medieval society. Perhaps most intriguingly, the night markets seem to have facilitated interfaith dialogue in ways that were unusual for the medieval world. Baghdad was religiously diverse, home to Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and others. Formal interfaith relations were carefully managed, often tense. But in the night markets, people of different faiths interacted as customers and merchants, as intellectual colleagues, as neighbours sharing public space. A Jewish physician might discuss medical texts with a Muslim scholar in a bookshop. A Christian merchant might share tea with a Zoroastrian trader while conducting business. These interactions didn't eliminate religious tensions or create perfect harmony. Medieval Baghdad had its share of sectarian conflict. But the night markets provided regular routine opportunities for peaceful coexistence and even collaboration that helped moderate the worst impulses of religious division. What becomes clear is that Baghdad's night markets weren't just an economic institution. They were a social technology, a way of creating public space that allowed for kinds of exchange, intellectual, cultural, religious, that formal institutions couldn't easily accommodate. They were laboratories for ideas, incubators for innovation, meeting grounds for minds that might never have connected otherwise. This deeper function explains why the night markets mattered so much to Baghdad's intellectual golden age. They weren't peripheral to the translation movement, the scientific advances, the philosophical developments that made Baghdad famous. They were infrastructure that made those achievements possible, the books that were written in the night market tea houses, the conversations that happened between the stalls, the collaborations that formed under lamplight. These created medieval Baghdad's greatest legacy. Not the buildings or the wealth, but the ideas. There's a moment when something transforms from experiment to institution, from novelty to norm. For Baghdad's night markets, that moment came during the reign of Harun al-Rashid. Harun became caliph in 786, at the age of about 22. He inherited an empire at the height of its power and wealth. Baghdad was already the largest city in the world, already a centre of learning and commerce, already experimenting with nighttime trade. But the night markets were still informal, technically illegal, officially tolerated but not officially sanctioned. They existed in a grey area of urban regulation, persistent because they were profitable and popular, but vulnerable to prohibition if religious conservatives or bureaucratic reformers decided to crack down. Harun changed that. In 792 he issued a decree that formalised the night markets, brought them under official regulation, assigned them specific districts, created a system of licenses and taxes, and most importantly provided municipal support for infrastructure. Why did he do this? The historical sources don't give us a single clear answer, but we can reconstruct the likely motivations. First, revenue. Harun was engaged in expensive military campaigns against the Byzantine Empire. He was also a lavish patron of arts and sciences, funding translation projects, supporting poets and musicians, building libraries and observatories. All this required money. The night markets represented untapped tax revenue, a resource that could be captured if they were formalised. Second, reputation. Harun wanted to be remembered as a great caliph, one who surpassed his predecessors in cultural achievement. Making Baghdad into a city that literally never slept, that offered commerce and culture around the clock, would be a demonstration of the empire's sophistication and strength. Third, pressure from merchants. The informal night markets had grown large enough that merchants operating in them wanted legal protection. They wanted contracts to be enforceable, property rights to be recognised, the ability to appeal to courts if they were cheated or robbed. Formalisation gave them that protection. Fourth, and perhaps most interesting, religious considerations. There was a theological debate happening in Islamic scholarship about the proper use of time. Some conservative scholars argued that nighttime should be reserved for prayer and rest, that commerce after dark violated the natural order established by God. But other scholars, particularly those influenced by Greek philosophy, argued that time was neutral, that what mattered was how it was used. If people chose to work and trade at night rather than waste time in idleness, wasn't that praiseworthy? If the night markets facilitated the exchange of knowledge and goods, didn't that serve Islamic values of learning and commerce? Harun sided with the more liberal interpretation. His decree framed the night markets as consistent with Islamic principles, as an expression of the dynamic, cosmopolitan character of a Abbasid civilization. The formalization changed everything. With official sanction came investment. The government funded street lighting along major market thoroughfares. The lamps weren't just functional, they were artistic, designed by master craftsmen, suspended from ornate poles, creating an aesthetic environment that enhanced the pleasure of nighttime commerce. Security was professionalized. Instead of ad hoc arrangements between merchant guilds and local toughs, there was an official night watch trained, uniformed, paid from the treasury. They carried distinctive lanterns that identified them as authorities. They had legal power to arrest criminals and adjudicate minor disputes on the spot. Fire prevention became systematic. The government required market buildings to meet specific construction standards. Wood was banned in the most active districts, replaced with brick and stone. Water cisterns were strategically positioned. Firefighting equipment was standardized and maintained. Most importantly, formalization attracted investment. Merchants who had been operating informally, avoiding taxes but also risking confiscation, now obtained licenses and built permanent structures. The night markets shifted from makeshift stalls to proper shops with solid architecture, storage facilities, display cases, comfortable spaces for customers to browse and negotiate. The decree also specified which districts could operate night markets. This was partly about organization, ensuring that markets didn't interfere with residential areas, but it was also about creating destination districts, areas that became known for specific types of goods and specific kinds of atmosphere. The luxury district near the palace focused on jewellery, fine textiles, rare books, perfumes, goods for the wealthy. The riverside district catered to foreign merchants, with warehouses that could receive goods directly from ships, with translators available in multiple languages, with lodging and banking services. The intellectual district, which developed organically around existing tea houses and bookshops, was given special protection. Harun understood that the informal scholarly gatherings happening in the night markets contributed to Baghdad's reputation. He wanted to encourage them, not just tolerate them. Within a decade of Harun's decree, the night markets had doubled in size. They employed thousands of people directly, vendors, guards, lamplighters, cleaners, and thousands more indirectly, craftsmen making goods to sell, farmers providing food for night vendors, labourers transporting merchandise. The economic impact was substantial. Baghdad's tax revenues increased. Foreign merchants extended their stays, which meant they spent more money in the city. Local artisans found new markets for luxury goods. The scholarly community grew as the night markets made it easier for intellectuals to gather and collaborate. But there were also unintended consequences. Some daytime merchants resented the competition. Neighbourhoods near night market districts complained about noise and traffic. Religious conservatives continued to grumble that the whole enterprise was spiritually questionable, and formalization brought regulation, which brought bureaucracy. There were rules about hours of operation, specifications for lamp oil quality, requirements for waste disposal, taxes on every transaction. Some of the spontaneity and flexibility that had characterized the early informal markets was lost. Still, the transformation was largely positive. The night markets became an established feature of Baghdad's urban landscape, as normal and expected as the daytime markets, the mosques, the libraries, the palaces. They were no longer an experiment, they were Baghdad. And Harun al-Rashid, whether he knew it or not, had created something that would outlast his reign, outlast his dynasty, outlast the city itself. He had proven that darkness could be civilized, that night could be just another time for human activity and achievement. He had shown the world what was possible, even if the world wasn't quite ready to learn the lesson. Harun al-Rashid's formalization of the night markets unleashed consequences that reshaped Baghdad's economy and culture in ways no one had predicted. The most immediate effect was scale. Within 20 years of the decree, the night markets employed more people than some European cities contained in their entire population. Thousands of merchants, craftsmen, labourers, guards, and support workers made their living in the nocturnal economy. This created a new social class, people whose lives operated on inverted schedules, who slept during the day and worked at night. They developed their own rhythms, their own communities, their own culture distinct from the daytime population. Night workers lived differently. They ate different foods designed to sustain energy through long dark hours. They socialized in different spaces, tea houses and taverns that catered specifically to nocturnal schedules. They even developed their own slang, a vocabulary for navigating darkness that daytime speakers didn't need. Children of night market families grew up in this inverted world. They learned trades by lamplight, played in streets lit by suspended lanterns, understood the city through its nocturnal geography. For them, the night markets weren't exotic or unusual. They were simply home. The economic ripple effects extended far beyond Baghdad itself. As word spread that the Abbasid capital offered 24-hour commerce, foreign merchants adjusted their routes and schedules. Caravans from Central Asia timed their arrivals for evening, knowing they could immediately begin selling rather than waiting overnight. Ships from India and China carried goods specifically intended for Baghdad's night markets, luxury items that commanded premium prices in the lamplit bazaars. This trade integration accelerated Baghdad's accumulation of wealth. The city had always been rich, but the night markets made it richer. They created efficiency, reducing the time merchants spent waiting, increasing the volume of transactions that could occur in a given period, generating more tax revenue for the caliphate. That revenue funded further expansion. Harun and his successors invested in infrastructure throughout Baghdad and across the empire. New roads, new canals, new bridges, new public buildings. The night markets became an economic engine that drove broader development. But wealth attracted envy and resentment. Other Islamic cities watched Baghdad's success with mixed feelings. Some tried to imitate the night markets. Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba and Samarkand all experimented with extended market hours, attempting to capture some of Baghdad's commercial magic. None succeeded at the same scale. They lacked Baghdad's combination of climate, population, infrastructure and cultural support. Their night markets remained small, seasonal, or limited to specific goods. Baghdad's dominance in nocturnal commerce remained unchallenged. This created tension within the Islamic world. Merchants in rival cities complained that Baghdad's unfair advantage, its ability to operate around the clock, gave it monopolistic control over long-distance trade. They pressured their own rulers to either match Baghdad's offering or prohibit it as religiously improper. Some religious scholars argued that the night markets represented dangerous innovation, a departure from proper Islamic practice. They cited hadith about the importance of rest, about the spiritual dangers of darkness, about the need for community rhythms tied to the sun and prayer times. These theological objections found audiences among conservatives who were already uncomfortable with Baghdad's cosmopolitan culture, its embrace of Greek philosophy, its tolerance of non-Islamic ideas. The night markets became a symbol in a larger cultural conflict about what Islamic civilization should be, but the economic and cultural momentum was too strong to reverse. By the early 9th century, Baghdad's night markets were too embedded in the city's identity, too important to its economy, too beloved by its population to be abolished by religious decree. The consequence was a kind of cultural divergence. Baghdad represented one vision of Islamic civilization, cosmopolitan, intellectually adventurous, economically innovative, comfortable with borrowing ideas from other traditions. Other cities represented different visions, more conservative, more focused on religious purity, more suspicious of foreign influence. This wasn't absolute. No city was entirely one thing or the other. But the night markets crystallized differences, made them visible and debatable. The cultural effects within Baghdad were equally profound. The night markets changed how people thought about time itself. The traditional division of life into daylight activity and nighttime rest dissolved. Time became more fluid, more flexible, more subject to individual choice and economic need. This had philosophical implications. If the natural rhythm of day and night could be overcome through human ingenuity, what other natural limits might be transcended? If darkness could be illuminated, if night could be made productive, what else was possible? These questions energized Baghdad's intellectual community. They connected to broader debates happening in Islamic philosophy about human agency, about the relationship between natural law and divine command, about the extent to which humans could and should reshape their world. The night markets became a living argument in these debates, proof that human beings could fundamentally alter the conditions of their existence, that civilization was about transcending nature rather than merely accepting it. But there were also costs. The expanded economy created new forms of inequality. Those who could afford to shop in the lamplit luxury districts lived very differently from those who worked in them. The night markets employed many people, but often in menial positions, lamplighters and cleaners and porters whose labour sustained the system but who didn't share equally in its prosperity. Some historians argue that the night markets accelerated social stratification in Baghdad, creating sharper divisions between rich and poor, between those who enjoyed the city's cultural offerings and those who merely served them. The environmental costs were also significant. Burning oil for illumination at such scale required massive supplies. Olive and sesame cultivation expanded across Mesopotamia to feed the lamps. The smoke from thousands of burning lamps created air quality issues. The waste, spent oil and broken ceramic accumulated in quantities that strained the city's sanitation systems. Baghdad managed these challenges through regulation and infrastructure investment, but they were real costs, trade-offs that came with the benefits of nocturnal commerce. The night markets were not an unqualified triumph. They were a complex innovation with mixed consequences, positive and negative, intended and unintended. They made Baghdad wealthier and more influential. They also made it more unequal and environmentally stressed. They demonstrated human capability to reshape the world. They also revealed the costs of that reshaping. The consequences rippled outward through space and time, affecting cities across the Islamic world, shaping debates about religion and culture, influencing how people thought about progress and possibility. The night markets had become more than markets. They had become a force, an idea, a question about what human beings could and should do with the darkness. The night markets of Baghdad didn't just change their own time, they echoed forward through history, influencing cities and cultures in ways that most people never recognize. The most direct impact was on medieval trade, networks. Baghdad's 24-hour commerce set a new standard for commercial sophistication that other trading centres felt pressure to match. Venice, which would become Europe's dominant trading power in later centuries, studied reports of Baghdad's markets and borrowed organisational principles. Venetian merchants who travelled to the Islamic world in the 9th and 10th centuries returned with descriptions of the night markets, the regulation systems, the lighting infrastructure, the integration of banking and commercial services. When Venice developed its own mercantile institutions, echoes of Baghdad's innovations appeared in the organisation of markets, the regulation of guilds, the provision of public amenities. The Venetians never operated full-scale night markets. European culture and climate didn't support it. But they learned from Baghdad's example that extending commercial hours, creating specialised market districts, investing in infrastructure to support trade, these strategies generated wealth and competitive advantage. Similar transmission occurred through the Islamic world. As Muslim traders and scholars moved between cities, they carried knowledge of Baghdad's systems with them. The souks of Damascus, the bazaars of Cairo, the markets of Cordoba, all showed Baghdad's influence in their organisation, their regulation, their understanding of what urban commerce could be. But the impact went beyond commercial practice. The night markets influenced how people thought about urban life itself, about the relationship between public and private space, about the role of darkness in human society. Medieval Europe largely treated night as dangerous, as a time when honest people should be indoors, when the streets belonged to criminals and supernatural threats. Cities imposed curfews, required lights to be covered, viewed darkness with suspicion and fear. Baghdad demonstrated an alternative. Night could be civilized, illuminated, made safe for public activity. Darkness was not inherently dangerous. It was simply a condition that required different infrastructure and different organization. This idea, that night could be a time for legitimate public activity, slowly percolated through medieval and early modern culture. It took centuries. European cities didn't develop true nightlife until the advent of gaslighting in the 19th century. But the conceptual groundwork, the notion that extending public life after dark was possible and potentially beneficial, had roots in Baghdad's example. The intellectual impact may have been even more significant. The night markets created spaces where ideas could circulate informally, where scholars from different backgrounds could meet and collaborate, where knowledge could be exchanged outside formal institutional channels. This model influenced the development of coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire and later in Europe. The coffee house, a space for conversation and intellectual exchange, descended, in part from the tea houses of Baghdad's night markets. When European cities developed coffeehouse culture in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were unconsciously replicating patterns that had existed in Baghdad 800 years earlier. The connection between nocturnal commerce and intellectual innovation also influenced European thinking about cities and creativity. The idea that cities are crucibles of innovation, that they generate new ideas through the collision of different perspectives, this understanding was shaped by examples like Baghdad, where cosmopolitan night markets facilitated intellectual exchange. Some of the scientific achievements of the Islamic Golden Age owed their existence to the infrastructure the night markets provided. Astronomers working after dark had access to food, light, company, resources. Translators could gather in bookshops to compare their work. Mathematicians could test ideas through debate in tea houses. When this knowledge eventually reached medieval Europe through translation movements in Spain and Sicily, it came freighted with implicit lessons about how intellectual communities functioned, about the importance of informal exchange, about the value of creating spaces where ideas could circulate freely. The night markets also demonstrated principles of urban planning that influenced later thinking, the idea of organizing districts by function, of providing public infrastructure to support commercial activity, of using regulation to ensure quality and prevent fraud. These weren't unique to Baghdad, but Baghdad implemented them at unprecedented scale. When Renaissance Italian cities developed their commercial quarters, when early modern European cities began thinking systematically about urban planning, echoes of Baghdad's organizational principles appeared. The connection was often indirect, filtered through multiple intermediaries, but the influence was real. Perhaps most subtly, the night markets influenced how people thought about time itself. The medieval European understanding of time was cyclical, tied to agricultural seasons and religious calendars, divided into daylight activity and nighttime rest. This reflected both necessity and theology, the idea that God had ordained the rhythm of day and night for human observance. Baghdad challenged that understanding. Time could be linear, progressive, subject to human manipulation. The boundary between day and night was not sacred or fixed, but practical and negotiable. What mattered was not when something happened, but what was achieved. This more instrumental view of time as a resource to be used efficiently, rather than a divine gift to be reverently observed, eventually became central to modern industrial capitalism. The factories of 19th century Europe operated around the clock, just as Baghdad's markets had. The shift from natural to clock time, from cyclical to linear temporality, began in places like medieval Baghdad. We live in a 24-hour world now. Major cities never sleep. Commerce operates continuously. The internet never closes. We take this for granted, see it as a natural consequence of modern technology. But it's not natural. It's a choice, one that Baghdad made more than 1,000 years ago. The infrastructure has changed. We use electricity instead of oil lamps, computers instead of merchant ledgers. But the underlying principle, that human activity need not be constrained by solar rhythms, that darkness can be overcome through ingenuity and investment, that's Baghdad's legacy. Every time you check your phone at midnight, every time you order food late at night, every time you walk through a well-lit city street after dark, you're living in a world that Baghdad helped create. The night markets are gone, destroyed by invasion and time, but their impact endures in structures and systems we no longer recognize as having a history. In assumptions about urban life we think are modern innovations. Baghdad showed the world what was possible. It took 1,000 years for the world to catch up. Behind the grand narrative of night markets and economic innovation, there were people. Ordinary people whose names we'll never know, whose lives are documented only in fragments, whose experiences shaped the reality of nocturnal Baghdad. Consider the lamplighters. Every evening as the sun descended behind the western walls, they emerged with their poles and oil, moving through the market districts igniting thousands of lamps. This wasn't glamorous work. It required climbing, balancing, careful handling of open flames. The oil left stains on clothing and skin. The smoke irritated eyes and lungs. One lamplighter, a man named Salim ibn Harun, appears in court records from the year 815. He was injured when a lamp pole broke, causing him to fall and fracture his leg. The case involved determining whether his employer, a merchant guild, was liable for medical costs. The judge ruled in Salim's favour, establishing that employers had responsibility for worker safety. The brief record gives us a glimpse. Salim had worked as a lamplighter for 12 years. He had a wife and 3 children. His injury meant he couldn't work for months, putting his family in financial distress. The compensation he received barely covered his lost wages. This was the reality behind the romantic lamplight. People like Salim, whose labour made the night markets possible, who risked their bodies to keep the lights burning, who received modest pay and little recognition. Or consider the night watchmen. They walked patrol routes through the market districts, responsible for preventing crime, assisting lost visitors, responding to emergencies. The job required alertness through hours when the body naturally wanted to sleep. It required judgment in tense situations. It sometimes required courage when confronting criminals or breaking up fights. The watchmen came from diverse backgrounds. Some were retired soldiers, too old for military campaigns but still capable of maintaining order. Some were young men saving money to start their own businesses. Some were immigrants from the empire's periphery, Berbers and Turks and Persians drawn to Baghdad by employment opportunities. They developed their own culture, their own camaraderie. There were taverns near the market districts that catered specifically to night watchmen, places where they could gather after their shifts, share stories, complain about difficult merchants or dangerous drunks, form the bonds that helped them endure the loneliness of night patrol. The women who participated in the night markets left fewer traces, but they were there. We know about the female merchants because they appear in tax records and legal documents. They sold perfumes, cosmetics, textiles, goods marketed primarily to other women. Some were widows continuing their husbands' businesses. Some were independent operators who found the night markets offered opportunities denied them in daytime commerce. One court case from 823 mentions a perfume seller named Zainab. She was involved in a dispute over rent for her shop space. The details reveal that she had operated her perfume business for 8 years, that she employed 2 assistants, that she had cultivated a loyal customer base among wealthy women who appreciated shopping in the relative privacy of evening hours. Zainab's voice doesn't survive. We don't know what she thought about her work, whether she found it fulfilling or merely necessary, whether she resented the constraints of her society or made peace with them. But her presence in the records proves that women found ways to carve out economic independence in Baghdad's night markets. The musicians and poets who performed in the night markets formed their own subculture. They were a mix of talented artists and desperate performers, people who chose nocturnal entertainment and people who had no other options. They worked for tips, competing for the attention and coins of passers-by, developing reputations that could lead to patronage from wealthy merchants or even the caliphal court. One poet, a man named Abu al-Faraj, left behind a collection of verses that described his experiences working the night markets. He wrote about the exhaustion of performing until dawn, the humiliation of begging for coins, the occasional joy when a poem resonated with listeners and they responded with generosity. Abu al-Faraj never became famous. His poetry wasn't technically brilliant, but his verses capture something authentic about the precarious life of street performers, the constant balancing between art and survival, the way night market culture allowed for creative expression even in poverty. The foreign merchants who visited Baghdad's night markets came from extraordinary distances. There were traders from China who had spent months travelling the Silk Road, carrying silk and porcelain and tea. There were merchants from East Africa with ivory and gold dust and exotic spices. There were Vikings from Scandinavia with furs and amber and slaves. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, experienced Baghdad as a revelation. They came from cities that closed at dusk, from cultures where darkness meant danger. The lamplit streets, the crowds shopping at midnight, the mixture of languages and goods and ideas, it must have seemed like stepping into another world entirely. Some wrote about their experiences. A merchant from Samarkand named Ibn Fadlan described shopping in Baghdad's night markets in letters sent back to his family. He marvelled at the variety of goods, the efficiency of the commercial systems, the safety of walking through crowds carrying valuable merchandise without fear of robbery. But he also noted his loneliness. Far from home, surrounded by foreigners speaking languages he barely understood, conducting business in a city whose customs and rhythms felt alien. The night markets were impressive, but they could also be isolating for those who didn't belong to the community. The children who grew up in night market families lived in a world perpendicular to everyone else's experience. They slept during the day and worked or played at night. They learned to navigate by lamplight, to recognize the sounds and smells of nocturnal commerce, to exist in a temporal space most people never experienced. Some of them thrived. They inherited family businesses, expanded them, became successful merchants in their own right. Some struggled with the inverted schedule, with the isolation from daytime society, with health problems caused by disrupted sleep patterns. One physician's notebook from the 9th century describes treating children of night market workers for various ailments. Many showed signs of vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight. Some had vision problems from extended exposure to flickering lamplight. Some exhibited behavioral issues that the physician attributed to irregular sleep schedules. Behind every innovation, behind every grand historical development, there are people whose lives were shaped by forces larger than themselves, who adapted as best they could, who made small decisions that accumulated into the patterns we call history. The night markets weren't built by caliphs and scholars alone. They were built by Salim the lamplighter, and Zainab the perfume seller, and Abu al-Faraj the poet, and thousands of others whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't preserved, whose labour and creativity and suffering made Baghdad's nocturnal miracle possible. They're forgotten now, but they were real. They lived and worked and hoped and struggled in the lamplight. They were the night markets, far more than any building or regulation or economic system. They were the human heart beating beneath the historical surface. Not everyone celebrated Baghdad's night markets. From the beginning, they faced resistance, criticism, and active opposition from multiple directions. The religious conservatives were the most vocal. They argued that the night markets violated the natural order established by God, that darkness was meant for rest and prayer, that extending commerce into nighttime hours showed dangerous worldliness and spiritual decline. A preacher named Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who became one of the most influential Islamic scholars in history, spoke against the night markets during public sermons in the 820s. He didn't call for them to be banned outright, but he questioned whether they were truly compatible with Islamic piety. Ibn Hanbal argued that the Prophet Muhammad and his companions had lived simply, that they had observed natural rhythms of work and rest, that the elaborate commercial culture of Baghdad, especially its nocturnal aspects, represented innovation in the religious sense, departures from the pure practice of early Islam. His sermons attracted followers, people who were already uneasy about Baghdad's cosmopolitan culture, its embrace of Greek philosophy, its tolerance of diverse religious communities. The night markets became a symbol in a broader cultural war about what Islamic civilization should value. These religious conservatives faced a difficult problem, though. Islamic law and tradition explicitly encouraged commerce. The Prophet himself had been a merchant. Trade was respected and regulated in Islamic jurisprudence. It wasn't easy to argue that commerce itself was problematic. So the conservatives focused on the nighttime aspect. They cited hadith about the importance of sleep, about the spiritual dangers of darkness, about the need for community rhythms tied to prayer times. They argued that even if commerce was good, there was something spiritually unhealthy about markets that never closed. But they couldn't generate enough support to actually shut down the night markets. The caliph supported them, the merchant class depended on them, the general population enjoyed them. Religious opposition remained constant but ineffective. Different resistance came from daytime merchants who saw the night markets as unfair competition. If shops could stay open at night, daytime-only vendors were at a disadvantage. They had access to customers for only half the potential hours. They paid the same guild fees but had less opportunity to profit. Some daytime merchants petitioned to extend their own hours. Others demanded that night vendors pay higher taxes to compensate for their advantage. A few tried to organize boycotts, refusing to do business with merchants who operated after dark. The merchant guilds, which included both day and night vendors, struggled to mediate these conflicts. They established regulations attempting to differentiate the two markets, requiring that certain goods only be sold during the day, reserving other products for night vendors. This worked imperfectly, creating its own resentments and enforcement problems. The opposition also came from ordinary residents whose homes were near the market districts. They complained about noise, about drunken customers wandering through residential streets at late hours, about increased crime in areas adjacent to the markets, about the smoke and smell from thousands of oil lamps burning through the night. Court records document numerous complaints. Residents sued for compensation when property values declined because of proximity to night markets. Neighborhood associations petitioned the caliph for relief from noise and disturbance. Some wealthy families simply moved, abandoning homes that had become unlivable due to nocturnal commercial activity. The municipal government tried to address these complaints through zoning and regulation. They established buffer zones between residential and commercial areas. They set limits on operating hours, requiring most night markets to close before dawn to give neighbours some quiet hours. They imposed fines for excessive noise and public disturbance. But enforcement was difficult. Markets were profitable. Merchants had incentive to push boundaries. Customers wanted access at all hours. The night watch couldn't be everywhere. Regulations existed but were often violated. Another form of opposition came from rival cities. Damascus and Cairo resented Baghdad's commercial dominance. Their rulers saw the night markets as an unfair advantage that diverted trade and wealth to the Abbasid capital. Some rivals attempted sabotage. There are records of spies sent to Baghdad to report on night market operations, presumably so other cities could copy them. There are accounts of rival merchants deliberately spreading rumours that Baghdad's markets were unsafe or fraudulent, trying to redirect trade to their own cities. More subtly, intellectual opposition emerged. Some philosophers and physicians questioned whether disrupting natural sleep patterns was healthy. They argued that humans were designed to rest at night, that artificial light and extended activity violated natural law, that the night markets might be economically beneficial in the short term, but physically harmful in the long term. A physician named Hunayn ibn Ishaq, famous for his medical translations from Greek, wrote a treatise on sleep in which he warned against disrupting the body's natural rhythms. He didn't specifically attack the night markets, but his arguments were used by critics who claimed that nocturnal commerce was medically inadvisable. Even within the caliphal court there was ambivalence. Some advisors worried that the night markets made Baghdad too dependent on a system that could collapse if war or economic crisis disrupted the elaborate infrastructure required to maintain them. They argued for diversification, for ensuring that the city's economy could function if the night markets ever had to be abandoned. There were also concerns about moral decay. Some courtiers believed that the night markets encouraged licentiousness, that darkness provided cover for activities that would be shameful in daylight. They pointed to the presence of taverns and entertainers, to the relatively relaxed gender segregation in evening markets, to the general atmosphere of pleasure and consumption as evidence that the night markets were spiritually corrupting. These various forms of opposition never succeeded in eliminating the night markets, but they did constrain and shape them. Regulations increased. Zoning became stricter. Religious authorities maintained pressure for limits and oversight. The night markets survived but never expanded as freely as they might have without opposition. The resistance revealed something important about innovation and social change. New systems don't emerge smoothly. They face resistance from people whose interests are threatened, whose values are challenged, whose lives are disrupted. Progress, if we want to call it that, is always contested. The night markets succeeded not because everyone agreed they were beneficial, but because enough powerful interests supported them to overcome opposition. They survived because they generated enough wealth and satisfaction to justify the costs and disruptions. But the opposition was real, persistent, and sometimes persuasive. The night markets weren't an unqualified good. They created winners and losers, benefits and costs, pleasure and pain. Understanding the resistance helps us understand the night markets themselves, not as an inevitable development or obvious improvement, but as a contested choice with complicated consequences that different people reasonably evaluated differently. History is full of conflicts that have no clear heroes or villains, just people pursuing their interests and values, sometimes creating something remarkable, sometimes destroying something valuable. The night markets were both. Somewhere in the early 9th century, the night markets transformed from commercial institutions into something more profound, into stages for a cultural awakening that would define Baghdad's golden age. The shift happened gradually, almost invisibly. Merchants who stayed open late noticed that their customers lingered, that they weren't just shopping but conversing, that the evening hours created space for different kinds of interaction than the rushed business of daylight commerce. Tea houses multiplied. They had always existed, but they proliferated in and around the night markets, becoming centres of intellectual and cultural life. The most successful weren't just serving tea, they were curating conversations, attracting poets and philosophers, becoming salons where ideas were exchanged as freely as coins. One particular tea house, known simply as the House of Wisdom Street, became legendary. It wasn't actually affiliated with Baghdad's famous House of Wisdom library, but it was located nearby and attracted scholars who worked there. The owner, a man named Yahya, deliberately created an atmosphere conducive to discussion. He kept the lighting soft enough for intimacy but bright enough for reading. He employed servers who understood that conversations shouldn't be interrupted unless requested. He stocked books and manuscripts that customers could browse while drinking tea. He somehow created a space that felt both public and private, open to anyone but respectful of focused thought. Historians and philosophers began using Yahya's tea house as an informal meeting place. They would finish their work at the House of Wisdom and migrate to the tea house to continue discussions in a more relaxed setting. Students joined them. Visiting scholars from across the Islamic world sought out the tea house because they'd heard it was where Baghdad's intellectual elite gathered. The conversations that happened in that space influenced the development of Islamic philosophy, mathematics and science. Ideas that would later be formalized in treatises were first tested in tea house debates. Collaborations formed over cups of fragrant tea that produced translations and commentaries that shaped European thought centuries later. This pattern repeated across the night market districts. Bookshops became gathering places for translators, perfume shops hosted poetry readings, even ordinary merchant stalls became spaces where culture and commerce intertwined. The night markets also incubated musical innovation. The cooler evening hours attracted musicians who played for tips, but also experimented with new styles, blending Persian, Arab and Byzantine musical traditions into something distinctively Baghdad. One musician, a Persian immigrant named Ziryab, supposedly developed a revolutionary approach to the oud, adding a fifth string and introducing new playing techniques. Whether he actually performed in the night markets is debated, but the cultural ferment of nocturnal Baghdad certainly created the environment where musical innovation could flourish. Poetry underwent a similar renaissance. The classical Arabic poetic tradition was ancient and highly formalized, governed by strict rules about meter and rhyme and subject matter. But the night market poets, performing for diverse audiences in cosmopolitan settings, began pushing against those conventions. They wrote in simpler language, accessible to non-Arabs. They addressed contemporary urban life rather than the traditional desert themes. They experimented with new forms and structures. Some of this innovation was driven by necessity, poets trying to capture the attention of passing crowds. But it produced genuine artistic development. The most talented night market poets attracted patronage from wealthy merchants, and eventually from the Caliphal court. Their careers demonstrated that cultural innovation could emerge from commercial spaces, that art didn't require aristocratic patronage to develop, that popular and elite culture could fertilize each other. Visual arts flourished in the night markets. Craftsmen producing goods for sale began to see their work as artistic as well as functional. The lamp makers created vessels of extraordinary beauty. Textile merchants commissioned designs that were visual poems, geometric patterns with philosophical and spiritual significance. Calligraphers offered their services, but their work was aesthetic achievement as much as practical writing. This represented a shift in how Islamic culture thought about art and beauty. Earlier Islamic aesthetics had often been suspicious of representational art, wary of anything that might verge on idolatry. But decorative arts, geometric patterns, calligraphy, these could be both beautiful and religiously appropriate. The night markets became showcases for this aesthetic, spaces where beauty and commerce reinforced each other, where artisans could make a living while creating objects that transcended mere utility. The cultural awakening also manifested in how people talked and thought. The night markets brought together people from across the Islamic world and beyond: Arabs, Persians, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Indians, Africans. This diversity created linguistic and conceptual cross-pollination. Arabic vocabulary expanded to include Persian words, Greek concepts, Sanskrit ideas. new hybrid forms of expression emerged. The Baghdad dialect became its own thing, distinct from classical Arabic, incorporating elements from multiple languages, creating flexibility and richness that formal Arabic lacked. This linguistic creativity enabled new kinds of thinking. When languages blend, they create conceptual possibilities that didn't exist in either parent language. Baghdad's night markets were laboratories where words and ideas combined in novel ways, producing insights that monolingual, monocultural contexts couldn't generate. The awakening wasn't limited to elite intellectual culture. Popular culture also flowered. Storytellers developed the episodic narrative style that would eventually produce 1001 Nights. Comedians performed satirical sketches about contemporary life. Acrobats and magicians offered entertainment that was simultaneously spectacular and accessible. This cultural efflorescence was enabled by the night markets, but also transformed them. Markets that had been primarily commercial became cultural destinations. People came not just to shop, but to experience the atmosphere, to participate in the intellectual and aesthetic life of the city, to be part of something larger than individual transactions. The cultural renaissance also reinforced Baghdad's sense of itself as the center of civilization. This wasn't just a rich city. It was a place where human creativity reached its highest expression, where knowledge and beauty and commerce intertwined to create something unprecedented. That self-conception had consequences. It attracted more talent to Baghdad. Scholars and artists wanted to be part of the Golden Age. It encouraged investment in culture. Wealthy patrons funded poets and philosophers because supporting culture was how you demonstrated your participation in Baghdad's greatness. But it also bred arrogance, a sense that Baghdad was uniquely enlightened, that other places were provincial and backward by comparison. This cultural pride would later contribute to vulnerabilities, to an inability to recognize threats, to a belief that civilization as advanced as Baghdad's was invulnerable. For now, though, in the early 9th century, the awakening was real and magnificent. The night markets had become more than markets. They were civilization's cutting edge, places where human possibility expanded, where the future was being imagined and created in lamplight conversations and artistic experiments and intellectual audacity. The darkness had been transformed into a space for enlightenment. The night belonged to knowledge, to beauty, to the human spirit expressing itself in every form imaginable. It was Baghdad's finest hour, though the hour would last less than a century before darkness returned in a different form. After decades of research, translation and analysis, a pattern emerged in the evidence that changed how historians understood not just the night markets, but Baghdad itself, and perhaps medieval civilization more broadly. The revelation was this: the night markets weren't primarily about economics, they were about freedom. This sounds simple, even obvious, but its implications are profound. Economic explanations for the night markets, climate adaptation, trade efficiency, wealth accumulation, these were all true but incomplete. They described mechanisms without capturing meaning. What the night markets really represented was a society choosing to expand the space for human autonomy, creating temporal and physical zones where people had more control over their own lives, where the rigid structures of medieval social hierarchy relaxed slightly, where possibility breathed. The evidence for this interpretation comes from unexpected places. Legal documents show that crimes committed in the night markets received different treatment than the same crimes committed elsewhere. There was greater tolerance for behavior that would have been punished more harshly in other contexts. This wasn't lawlessness. It was a different understanding of what the night markets were for. They were spaces where normal rules were slightly suspended, where people could be different versions of themselves than they were during the day. Women who had to be accompanied in public during daylight could move more freely in the evening markets. The crowds and darkness provided anonymity that daylight denied. This wasn't absolute liberation. Medieval Baghdad remained a patriarchal society, but it was meaningful expansion of possibility. Slaves and servants had more autonomy in the night markets. They ran errands, conducted business, made decisions that would have required permission during the day. The nighttime economy created spaces where status mattered less, where capability was what counted. Religious minorities, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, experienced the night markets differently than other public spaces. The cosmopolitan atmosphere, the focus on commerce rather than faith, created an environment where religious difference was less salient, where interaction across religious boundaries felt more natural. This wasn't tolerance in the modern sense. Medieval Baghdad had clear hierarchies based on religion, but the night markets provided pockets of relative equality, spaces where the usual markers of difference mattered less than they did elsewhere. The intellectual freedom of the night markets was perhaps most significant. In the caliphal court, in the mosques, even in the formal institutions of learning, there were limits to what could be questioned, boundaries of acceptable discourse. The night markets operated under looser constraints. Philosophical ideas that verged on heresy could be discussed in tea houses. Scientific hypotheses that challenged religious doctrine could be debated among scholars sipping tea in the lamplight. Poetry that pushed against social norms could be recited for crowds who valued artistic daring over orthodox propriety. This freedom wasn't unlimited. People still faced consequences for going too far. But the boundaries were wider, the risks lower, the space for intellectual experimentation greater. The revelation, then, is that Baghdad's night markets were a social technology for creating freedom within a hierarchical society. They were pressure valves, allowing tensions to dissipate through controlled expression. They were laboratories, permitting innovation that formal institutions couldn't accommodate. They were dreams, showing what life could be like if restrictions were eased. This explains why the night markets generated such passionate support and equally passionate opposition. They weren't just economic institutions, they were political and cultural statements about what kind of society Baghdad wanted to be. Supporters saw them as evidence that Islamic civilization was sophisticated enough to allow pluralism and dynamism. The night markets proved that order and freedom could coexist, that diversity could be strength, that human ingenuity could transcend natural constraints. Opponents saw them as dangerous precisely because they expanded freedom. They worried that loosening social control, even slightly, even temporarily, would lead to chaos. They believed that hierarchy was necessary for order, that restrictions protected people from their own worst impulses, that the night market's relative freedom was a slippery slope toward moral and social collapse. Both sides were partially right. The night markets did expand freedom, and that expansion did create tensions, but it also generated enormous creativity, prosperity, and cultural achievement. The question was whether the benefits justified the risks. Baghdad's answer for several centuries was yes. The freedom the night markets provided was worth the costs and dangers. The cultural ferment, the economic dynamism, the intellectual innovation, these were sufficiently valuable to justify accepting some disorder, some moral ambiguity, some challenge to established authority. This revelation reframes Baghdad's golden age. It wasn't just about wealth or knowledge. It was about creating spaces where people could be more fully human, where their capabilities could expand beyond the narrow roles society assigned them. The night markets allowed a dual merchant's daughter to discuss philosophy with scholars. They permitted a slave to develop business acumen that might eventually purchase his freedom. They enabled a poet from a marginal background to achieve fame and patronage. They created opportunities that formal social structures would have denied. This is the deeper historical truth. Great civilizations aren't just rich or powerful or knowledgeable. They're places that expand human possibility, that create spaces for people to become more than their circumstances would otherwise allow. Baghdad's night markets did that. They were, in their own medieval way, experiments in what we might call liberal values, the idea that people should have autonomy, that diversity enriches society, that freedom and order aren't opposites but can complement each other. The experiments weren't perfect. They operated within a slave-owning, patriarchal, religiously stratified society. The freedom they offered was partial, limited, constrained by the prejudices and structures of their time, but they were real. They expanded possibility. They showed that even in medieval conditions, societies could choose to create more freedom rather than less, could embrace complexity rather than imposing rigid simplicity, could trust people to navigate spaces of relative autonomy without descending into chaos. This is why the night markets matter to us now, beyond historical curiosity. They prove that freedom isn't just a modern value or a Western invention, it's a human aspiration that emerges across cultures and centuries whenever conditions permit. Baghdad chose freedom. It built the night markets as monuments to that choice, as spaces where the choice could be enacted and experienced, where people could taste what it felt like to have slightly more control over their own lives. That choice, more than the lamps or the regulations or the economic systems, is what made the night markets remarkable. That's the revelation that changes how we understand them. They were temples of freedom, disguised as bazaars. Sit with the night markets for a moment. Let them become more than historical facts. Let them ask questions. What does it mean that a medieval Islamic city achieved something that European cities wouldn't manage for 1,000 years? What does it say about our narratives of progress, our assumptions, about who leads and who follows in human development? The standard story of civilization, the one taught in many Western schools, presents a linear progression from ancient Greece and Rome through medieval Christian Europe to modern Western democracy and capitalism. In this narrative, the Islamic world is a side story, important mainly for preserving Greek texts during Europe's Dark Ages. But the night markets disrupt that narrative. They prove that medieval Islamic civilization wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was innovating, experimenting, achieving things that Christian Europe hadn't imagined. Baghdad was more cosmopolitan, more intellectually adventurous, more economically sophisticated than any European city of its era. This should make us humble about our historical assumptions. Progress isn't linear. Civilization doesn't move in one direction. Different societies reach different achievements at different times. What seems like the inevitable march of Western advancement is actually a messy, contingent process full of reversals and recoveries. The night markets also make us think about what we've lost. Baghdad's achievement didn't endure. The Mongol invasion of 1258 destroyed the city, killed perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, burned the libraries, dismantled the infrastructure that made the night markets possible. When Baghdad fell, something irreplaceable was destroyed. Not just buildings and books, but knowledge about how to organize a multicultural, intellectually vibrant, economically dynamic urban society. That knowledge had to be painfully rediscovered centuries later, recreated from different materials and different conditions. What else have we lost? What other achievements by forgotten civilizations? What other solutions to human problems? What other models of how to live together have vanished without trace? How much of what we think of as modern innovation is actually rediscovery of things people knew and somehow forgot? The night markets make us question our relationship with darkness. We live in a world of electric light, where night is barely distinguishable from day. We illuminate everything, push back darkness as if it were inherently threatening, as if visibility and safety are the same thing. But Baghdad found a different balance. It illuminated its night markets but didn't try to eliminate night entirely. There was still darkness, still rhythms of light and shadow, still a sense that night was different from day, even if both were available for human activity. Maybe we've gone too far in our conquest of night. Maybe there's wisdom in preserving darkness, in maintaining some distinction between day and night, in accepting that not everything needs to be equally available at all hours. Or maybe Baghdad was right that night should be a time for possibility, that darkness can be productive and creative, that limiting human activity to daylight hours is an arbitrary restriction that doesn't serve our needs or interests. These aren't questions with obvious answers. They're invitations to think about choices we've made, often unconsciously, about how we organize time and space and social life. The night markets also make us reflect on freedom and order. We tend to think these are opposed, that more freedom means less order, that societies must choose between liberty and stability. But Baghdad's night markets suggest a different possibility. They were highly regulated, but also relatively free. They had rules and oversight, but also permitted experimentation and diversity. Order and freedom reinforced each other instead of conflicting. This has implications for how we think about contemporary challenges. Can we create public spaces that are both safe and welcoming to diverse populations? Can we have regulations that protect without stifling? Can we build cities that allow for spontaneity and innovation while maintaining enough structure to function? Baghdad's answer was yes, at least for a while. The night markets worked. They lasted centuries. They generated enormous value, economic and cultural. They proved that the dichotomy between freedom and order is false, that creative regulation can enable liberty rather than constrain it. That lesson feels relevant now. We live in an era of deepening polarization, where every political question becomes framed as all or nothing, where compromise feels like betrayal. The night markets remind us that middle ground isn't just possible, but potentially superior to either extreme. The night markets also make us think about scale and sustainability. They required enormous resources to maintain: oil for lamps, personnel for security, infrastructure for lighting and safety. The ecological footprint was significant. Was it worth it? From an efficiency standpoint, probably not. Concentrating commerce into daylight hours would have been more resource efficient. But efficiency isn't everything. The cultural and intellectual achievements enabled by the night markets, the freedom they provided, the beauty they created, these had value too. We face similar trade-offs constantly. How much environmental cost is acceptable for how much human benefit? How do we balance sustainability with other values? There are no easy answers, but the night markets remind us that the questions are ancient, that every society struggles with these tensions. Perhaps most importantly, the night markets make us think about what we want cities to be. Are they purely functional, places to work and sleep and conduct necessary business? Or are they stages for human flourishing, spaces where culture and commerce and creativity intermingle, where strangers can become friends, where ideas can collide and combine? Baghdad chose the latter. It invested enormous resources into making its markets not just efficient but beautiful, not just economical but cultural. It created spaces that served multiple purposes, that met practical needs while also feeding souls. Modern urban planning could learn from this. We often separate functions, create zones for business and other zones for culture, residential areas over here and commercial areas over there. Maybe there's wisdom in Baghdad's more integrated approach, in creating spaces where different aspects of life coexist and cross-pollinate. The night markets can't tell us exactly what to do. We live in different times with different technologies and different challenges, but they can make us think, make us question, make us imagine alternatives to how we currently organize our collective lives. They can remind us that what seems natural and inevitable is actually chosen, that different societies make different choices, that we have more agency than we sometimes recognize. The night markets are gone. Baghdad is a different city now, shaped by centuries of war and occupation and struggle. The lamps have been extinguished for generations. But the questions remain. The possibilities endure. The invitation to think differently about time and space and freedom and beauty, that's still there, still relevant, still urgent. Maybe that's what history is really for, not to tell us what happened, but to help us imagine what could be. The night markets ended, of course. Everything does. The exact moment is difficult to pinpoint. They didn't stop suddenly. They faded gradually, as Baghdad itself declined from its 9th century heights. Economic pressures, political instability, changes in trade routes, all eroded the prosperity that had sustained the night markets. By the 11th century, the night markets had contracted significantly. They still existed but served a smaller area, attracted fewer merchants, employed fewer people. The elaborate infrastructure decayed. Lamps went unlit, security diminished, the cultural vibrancy faded. The Mongol invasion of 1258 delivered the final blow. When Hulagu Khan's armies sacked Baghdad, they destroyed not just buildings but systems. The irrigation channels that had sustained the city for millennia were wrecked. The population, which may have been 1 million at its height, was reduced to perhaps 100,000 survivors. The night markets, which required stable prosperity and complex infrastructure, couldn't survive such devastation. They vanished completely, living on only in memory and in fragments of text that historians would puzzle over centuries later. For a long time, that seemed to be the end of the story. The night markets were a curious historical anomaly, a brief experiment that failed, interesting to specialists but irrelevant to the broader sweep of history. But legacies don't always work the way we expect. The night markets left traces, echoes that rippled forward through time in ways that aren't always obvious. The souks that still operate across the Middle East and North Africa, the covered markets of Istanbul and Damascus and Marrakesh, they carry forward organizational principles and architectural designs that descend in part from Baghdad's night markets. The way they integrate different functions, the way they create public spaces that are both commercial and cultural, these reflect patterns that Baghdad pioneered. The coffeehouse culture that emerged in the Ottoman Empire and spread to Europe borrowed from the tea-house model that had flourished in Baghdad's night markets. The idea of a public space for conversation and intellectual exchange Open to anyone who could afford a cup of tea or coffee, that's a Baghdad innovation preserved in modified form. Even the modern 24-hour city, the aspiration that drives places like New York and Tokyo and Hong Kong, has roots that extend back to medieval Baghdad. The idea that cities can and should operate continuously, that night is just another time for human activity, that darkness can be illuminated and made productive. Baghdad proved that concept before anyone else. The physical traces are minimal. Some foundations, some fragments of lamps and signs, some architectural remnants incorporated into later buildings. If you visit modern Baghdad and know where to look, you can find suggestions of where the night markets once operated, but nothing that really captures what they were. The textual legacy is richer. Libraries across the world hold manuscripts that mention the night markets, that describe their operations, that capture fragments of the experience. These texts are studied by specialists, translated slowly, yielding details that help reconstruct a vanished world. But perhaps the most important legacy is conceptual. The night markets prove that medieval societies were capable of sophisticated urban innovation, that Islamic civilization achieved things that challenge Western narratives of progress, that human ingenuity can transcend the limitations of technology and circumstance. They prove that freedom is a universal human desire, not a modern or Western invention, that people across cultures and centuries have sought autonomy and possibility, have created spaces where life could expand beyond prescribed limits. They prove that cities can be more than purely functional spaces, that commerce and culture can reinforce each other, that beauty and practicality aren't opposed but can be integrated. They prove that the boundaries we accept as natural, between day and night, between public and private, between economic and intellectual, these are often arbitrary, subject to reimagination and reconstruction. Modern Baghdad bears little resemblance to its medieval predecessor. Centuries of invasion, occupation, war, and instability have reshaped the city repeatedly. The round city is gone. The palaces and libraries are ruins. The Tigris still flows, but along different banks through a different landscape. Yet the memory persists. Baghdadis know their city was once the centre of the world. They know it achieved things that seemed impossible. The night markets are part of that. Collective memory, a symbol of what Baghdad was when it led rather than followed, when it created rather than endured. There are people in Baghdad today who dream of revival, of restoring their city to something like its former glory. They talk about rebuilding the economy, reinvigorating the intellectual life, creating spaces where culture and commerce flourish again. Some of them reference the night markets explicitly, suggesting that modern Baghdad should develop nocturnal commercial districts, should create 24-hour economies that attract tourists and merchants. These proposals are usually impractical given current conditions, but they reveal something important. The night markets live in imagination as a model of possibility, a proof that Baghdad was once great and could be great again. The specific details matter less than what they represent. Human creativity overcoming obstacles, a city becoming more than the sum of its parts, light triumphing over darkness. That symbolic power may be the night market's most enduring legacy. They show that civilizations can choose to be ambitious, that societies can decide to push boundaries, that the constraints we face aren't always as fixed as they seem. They show that the world has been different and could be different again, that the current arrangement of things isn't inevitable or final, that human beings have agency to reshape their environments and their possibilities. As you drift towards sleep, let the night markets fade gently into dream. Let the lamplight soften. Let the sounds of commerce and conversation blur into whispers. Imagine yourself walking through those streets, feeling the cool night air off the Tigris, smelling spices and perfumes, hearing languages you don't understand but somehow comprehend. You're part of the crowd now, anonymous and connected, separate and together, free to move through the lamplight or step back into shadow. The night is yours. It was always yours. Baghdad just helped you remember. The markets are gone, but the light remains. In every city that refuses to sleep, in every space where strangers gather and ideas collide, in every moment when human beings choose possibility over safety, the night markets live. Not in buildings or regulations or economic systems, but in the choice to illuminate darkness, to create rather than accept, to make the world slightly more than it was. That choice endures. That legacy remains. The night belongs to us too. Rest now. The story is finished. but the light still burns,